Welcome to The Guilty Files, a podcast that rips the story open. One crime, two hosts, and truths that don't fit neatly into the box. It's messy, it's real, and it's all on the table. Now, let's open this week's file. So, Dani, let's get into this Jeffrey Dahmer case. Obviously, it's one that everybody's familiar with that has anything to do with true crime. What was the process like for you doing a deep dive on this case? You definitely take a different perspective and a different look at these cases. What was it like for you digging into the psyche and getting into a person like Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yeah, one of the biggest draws to me in this case, specifically to a case file like Jeffrey Dahmer's, is the role that childhood environments can play in shaping their criminal behavior. That really pulls me in to the file and really helps me gravitate towards the subject matter with authentic interest and intrigue.
Yeah, the thing that sticks out for me is there's tons of people who have shitty childhoods. I had a shitty childhood. You lost your dad at a very early age. That's one of those things that comes out often in these cases when you look at these people who eventually become serial killers and kidnappers and do all of these horrible things to other people. If you go back, there's oftentimes this childhood that people have. Dahmer was no exception. His mother was no saint. His dad was this non-present, checked out figure. That's one of those things that always fascinates me about these cases. Obviously, not everybody who has a shitty childhood ends up becoming a serial killer. After digging into this case, anything stuck out to you about Dahmer and maybe how that shaped him to eventually commit some of the crimes that he did later on in life?
Yeah, valid point. Pretty much all of us have elements of a childhood trauma or unstable home lives at some point in time over years of our adolescent upbringing. Structure and discipline can definitely vary. We all have issues with that as we develop and grow. A child's environment definitely shapes their identity. When love and support are replaced with chaos and neglect, it can definitely plant seeds of disconnection and desperation. Those seeds can ultimately grow into something unrecognizable. So for me, I think it's the consistency and the level of intensity at which a child might face chaos, neglect, and some of those challenging things to navigate. We all go through them, but some of us go through those in a much more consistent and intense way.
Part of my law enforcement history is I started working in a maximum security youth detention facility. One of the things that came up over and over talking to some of these kids, because we had a huge recidivism rate, meaning these kids came back over and over again. And it was one of those things that these kids were in the system. Somebody recognized something, they committed a crime, whether it was truancy or we had everything from child molestation going on to murder in this maximum security youth detention facility. And the common denominator was this. We would bring these kids into an environment where we gave them structure. We gave them 3 hot meals a day. They got to exercise. We made them go to school. It was what their home life should look like. It just took place behind bars. We would take these kids and do some sort of rehabilitation work over 30, 60, 90-day period that they might be in the facility. We would take them and turn them back into this environment that was horrible for them. I had so many conversations with kids over the years. I'd say, why do you keep coming back here? And they would say, because you guys take care of us. You care about us. You feed us. You give us clothing. All the things that their parents should be doing, they weren't getting at home. I had one kid in particular tell me, look, I stayed gone for 3 days the last time I got out, and I got picked back up and brought back in. He went home and his mom was cracked out on the couch. There was no food in the house. His dad was nowhere to be found. He went out and reoffended, so the police would bring him back into the facility because he knew he was going to get people who cared about him. He was going to be safe. He got 3 hots and a cot. I saw it firsthand. Unstable home lives set the stage for all kinds of destructive behavior, but that's not an excuse for their behavior. I don't know what else we could do as far as intervention maybe with Dahmer. I don't know how much of that really shaped Dahmer. I think Dahmer was going through a whole myriad of different things that eventually shaped him into the person that he became. I just don't know what else we could have done. But yeah, the home life and the childhood certainly helped shape that. But it goes back to this. just because you have a horrible home life and a bad childhood and maybe horrible parents, it doesn't make you kill people. But in Dahmer's case, he went on to be one of the most prolific and horrific serial killers that America has ever seen.
You're correct. It's definitely not an excuse, but it is a starting point for us to at least try to understand the path that Jeffrey or someone in his position might take. I'm curious if you can provide any insight or thoughts on if you believe early intervention programs, especially working in a detention center and having that experience, could prevent some of this trajectory. And specific to the Dahmer case, do you see an opportunity in his story where some type of intervention program could have been implemented and successfully shifted his trajectory?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think that it can be the case for some people in Jeffrey Dahmer's situation. I think that can help, but by and large, I don't think it does. I don't think that anything institutional per se is going to help some people with some of these deep-seated, really deeply rooted issues that I think Jeffrey had with his mother. I think he had some really deeply seated issues with his father, Lionel. I think there was a whole lot of things going there. And outside of maybe some really good one-on-one counseling, I don't think any of that stuff's going to help. I think some of those diversion tactics that are used in intervention programs can help some kids that are on a path that may be leading them down the wrong road. If we're talking about shoplifting and maybe teenage drinking or something like that is one thing, but to go on and murder as many people as Jeffrey did in the way that he did, I think there's some deeply rooted psychological issues there that a program like that may not even scratch the surface of. So no, I don't think in the big scheme of things, I don't think it would have made a huge difference in Jeffrey's life.
Curious to know if you think that Dahmer's upbringing was a product of a broader societal neglect rather than just familial. How do you say that word?
Familial.
Thank you. Like failure. There's a lot of focus on his home life. I think introspectively for us, we tend to reflect a lot on our isolated kind of home life or family dynamics, and it's easy to ruminate or get caught up in that really limited viewpoint. And I'm curious if you think shifting slightly to looking at a broader societal impact, if you think that societal neglect played, or how much of a role you think it might have played, either in Dahmer's case specifically, or generally speaking, in cases that we're seeing now.
Yeah, I think it certainly plays a point because I was a latchkey kid as a child. My mom and dad both worked the majority of the time when I was a kid. I basically took care of myself, but we had a good group of neighbors around us in most cases that I could turn to that would pick up the slack and help out where my mom and dad were failing. They had a horrible marriage and a horrible relationship, so I suffered at the hands of that as well. But I do think it is a broader issue. There's a reason that somebody said long ago, it takes a village to raise a child, and it truly does take a village. But I think in this day and age, specifically, we are so disconnected from everybody. I think we're disconnected from our neighbors. We don't have neighbors. We live on 40 acres in the middle of nowhere, so we don't really have that. But if you live in a neighborhood or you live in an apartment, very similar to the areas that Jeffrey Dahmer grew up in the 70s and 80s, neighbors don't know each other. They don't get involved in other people's lives. They don't talk about the kids. They don't help. Again, it goes back to, does everything contribute? Certainly, I think it was a failure in some areas because I think Jeffrey Dahmer had issues at school. I think there were teachers and administrators that probably picked up on some of the things that were happening in his life that maybe could have stepped in. But again, that's with everybody, right? We see movies and it's a theme in books and all kinds of things when teachers step in or administrators see something going on with the kid and they step in, and it makes a difference in a lot of kids' lives. But by and large, I think people tend to stick to their own business. And that is part of the reason that people like Jeffrey Dahmer and some of these other serial killers, we almost are complicit in some of the behavior that they exhibit because we are so detached from what's going on. We put our heads down, we look in our phones, and we bury our heads into the sand and just keep plowing through our day. I think that happened a lot of times, probably in Jeffrey Dahmer's case as a child and even early adulthood, as a teenager. We've seen the documentaries, we've dug into the case. Some of his neighbors had issues with what was going on. They saw people coming and going. They felt things were suspicious. They smelled things that didn't smell right. Some people did try to get involved, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a little bit with the Conorak phone case, had somebody got involved then, that would have stopped Jeffrey Dahmer dead in his tracks. And I think you did a fantastic job in your portion of the true crime rewritten portion of this. And talking about that case, by and large, people just put their heads down. They don't get involved. And ultimately, it's not their responsibility. And very few people go beyond their responsibilities to get involved in somebody else's kid's life or even a young adult who may be struggling and things like that. I just think it's one of those things that I don't necessarily fault people for, because I don't really get involved in other people's lives if it's not my business. I think it could have made a difference, but I'm not sure that it would have. Just like maybe a diversion program or an early intervention program from somebody else. I think it had to start with the parents. I think Joyce and Lionel, his parents, could have made a huge difference, but they didn't, because they were struggling with their own adult problems. They were going through issues with one another. I think Joyce had some substance abuse problems. I'm not so sure that his dad didn't have alcohol problems. They were just trying to survive. They were treading water. Ultimately, Jeffrey Dahmer suffered at the hands of his parents, and then that maybe clicked something way deeper in his psyche that happens to some people. And he became a horrible, horrific serial killer. Most people just grow up and become dysfunctional adults and they go about their lives, but something triggered deeper in Jeffrey Dahmer that drove him to kill all of these people. That's why we're talking about him today.
You mentioned it multiple times. I think it's the level of depth in which some of these things might occur to a person. That level of depth and intensity can really be the difference in what is a more common or shared kind of struggle or hurdle, especially in adolescence, versus those who experience something that just pushes them that one step deeper or further. I want to circle back. You made some interesting points about how you mentioned neighbors saw things. You even mentioned neighbors might have smelled things. You brought up multiple sensory experiences that people close to Jeffrey and his family were able to experience, maybe not pick up on or pursue, but at least experience. If you look at today's world, today's society, it's really easy in some of these cases that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's easy to really isolate the impact of maybe a family unit, neighbors, or you mentioned the school, these smaller kind of societal subgroups or structures, versus today, the amount of access, especially our youth have outside of their immediate sensory kind of experiences, i.e. through their phones and our computers and the internet. I can't imagine a parent trying to police or keep up with what all a child, especially through their development, is exposing themselves to or exploring or experimenting with. It's quite terrifying. I think this is one of the biggest reasons you and I maybe haven't pursued having children or raising children, because of the challenges that a modern day parent must face with the amount of access that children have to complete strangers, complete, fully realized environments. Although they're virtual, it's environments of communities, of people, of groups that have massive opportunities to influence or maybe intrigue a young budding mind to explore or even experiment with things that 40 years ago, they would have to do in their local community, or picking up roadkill, walking home from the gym or something like that. There's so many opportunities now virtually in the privacy and the safety of your home to explore those things. And there's an immense shift in the influence, and now where we can even look at what might influence from a responsibility point of view our youth. All right, folks, we've been deep in it today. Some heavy stuff. And if you're anything like me, you might be feeling like you need to stretch, take a breath, maybe smudge your space with a little sage.
Or pour yourself a stiff drink and reevaluate your life choices for tuning in. But seriously, we get it. These cases are dark. And while we're committed to digging deep and honoring the stories, sometimes we need a little palate cleanser.
And that's why we came up with a game we call Crime Confession. The game where we confess to things But no felonies, folks. That would be way too much paperwork.
I did enough of that in traffic enforcement. Trust me. But yeah, no Miranda warnings needed here.
Here's how it works. We're going to give each other crime-related confessions, hypothetical scenarios inspired by this week's case. The twist, we have to fess up to how we would handle it. Brian and I take turns being the suspect and the interrogator. And yes, we are absolutely judging each other's answers.
And so are you at home. Don't think we don't know.
Since this week, we're in the deep end with Jeffrey Dahmer, our crime confession will have Dahmer-esque twists, minus the freezer parts. Nobody wants that.
No, nobody. And if you do, please stop listening.
Seriously, though, we're keeping it creepy, but fun. And before anyone tweets us, yes, we're aware this guy was a monster, but sometimes finding a little levity helps us handle the darker stuff. All right, crime confession, round 1, the room that smells off. All right, Brian, here's your scenario. You're a rookie cop, brand new on patrol. You get called to a suspicious apartment in Milwaukee. When you walk in, you notice 2 things immediately. There's a guy standing there who looks like a discount Clark Kent if he never slept. And there's a smell. What do? And no, you can't just write him a parking ticket.
Well, first, I ask Clark Kent if he's got a valid driver's license and registration for that sketchy apartment. Standard procedure. Then I politely ask him about the smell. I mean, as a former traffic officer, I smelled things in impounded cars that would knock over a horse. So I'm not above a little curiosity. But in all seriousness, my gut says something's wrong. I'm calling in for backup, forensic unit, the whole shebang. You can't ignore your gut, and you don't walk away from a smell like that.
I love how you turn it into a field sobriety test, but for serial killers. And way to get the driver's license and make that point of contact form for some point. I mean, just FYI, it's not a point system for police officers. It didn't come from me.
All right, Dani, here's round 2, your turn. This is the mysterious barrel. Picture it. You're responding to a noise complaint, and you end up in an apartment. It's tidy, too tidy. Except there's a huge blue barrel in the corner. It smells industrial. What's your next move? You've got me on the side of the room claiming I'm an amateur brewer. Are you buying it?
I'm absolutely not buying it, Brian. I'm side-eyeing you so hard, you'd think I was checking for cataracts. I mean, an amateur brewer in an apartment in Milwaukee? Come on. It's either beer or bodies. But seriously, I would ask questions that sound casual, but are deliberate. You don't get confrontational too fast. You make them comfortable. And while they're talking, I'm calling for backup. And I'm not leaving that apartment until someone with a badge bigger than mine and gloves thicker than my hiking boots shows up.
Ah, the good old community cop charm. It works every time.
I try. It actually makes me think of, I did get a call one time at an apartment building about a trash can that smelled weird and had like decaying, crawling bugs literally like falling out of the lid that was slightly ajar. That was an interesting 911 call. So yeah, I've talked more drug dealers into confessions over a cup of coffee than I ever did by throwing cuffs on them. All right, let's play one more round. Round 3 is called Zombie Potion or Nah. Brian, imagine you're Dahmer himself. I know it's a stretch, you love a good barbecue, but not that much. You're obsessed with the idea of creating a compliant, zombie-like companion. You've done your amateur chemist thing, but it's not working. Let's face it, you're a huge Walking Dead fan, but you suck when it comes to math, so chemistry's not your strong suit. All right, back to round 3. Your experiment comes back to life in your living room. What do? Try again, give up, open a CrossFit gym?
Definitely open a CrossFit gym, absolutely, and call it Brains and Gains.
That's a good one.
Right, but seriously, if I'm in Dahmer's shoes, which thankfully I'm not, this is that moment where obsession overtakes logic. You got to double down. You tinker, you find the formula, But the bigger question is, why? Why is control so important that you're willing to destroy your life to keep someone near you? That's where Dahmer breaks from any kind of human empathy. And that's where he'd lose me.
You do love to tinker. That wasn't so scary. At least it wasn't about sex. It wasn't even about murder at a certain point. It was about not being left alone. And he was willing to erase people to avoid feeling abandoned. Now I'm depressed again.
And that, ladies and gents, was Crime Confession, where the questions are hypothetical, but the judgment is 100% real.
All right, folks, if you've got a scenario for us to debate on air, send it our way. Just keep it legal. And please, no more blue barrels.
I want to move on to that point of no return for Dahmer. Obviously, he had a crappy childhood. His parents were going through a lot of things. He was affected by all the things going on in his environment. He was a different kid than most. I think that's safe to say. But he got to that point of no return when he committed the first murder with Stephen Hicks, the hitchhiker he brought back to his home, hit him with a dumbbell, and killed him. He went out and tried to dispose of the body away from the house, got pulled over by a police officer for a traffic infraction. I don't know if he was weaving or speeding. I don't remember the exact details, but he got pulled over. And if this cop had just went a little bit further, I found myself in that part of the story going, man, would I have done the same thing? Would I have pulled this guy over and thought he was a little bit suspicious? When you got into that part of the story, did you find yourself going, what drove him to that point of taking this kid's life? And then when you do that, you're in that situation by yourself. The parents were gone. He had the house to himself. He's got this body to dispose of. What could have possibly been going through this guy's mind? I just killed somebody and now I've got to get rid of this body. What do you do at that point? Then he's at this point. Is it a point of no return, or is it a point of, man, I really enjoyed that. I'm going to do it again in the future? Psychologically, I just have a hard time with wrapping my brain around that. I think most people, most normal people, have the same thing. If you get into true crime long enough, first murders are rarely perfect. Dahmer was definitely no exception to this. It was a very sloppy, impulsive, and panicked act. He killed this kid. Now he's stuck with the body, and now he's trying to figure out how to control the situation. And of course, he's spiraling out of control. He doesn't know what to do. How did you feel when you got into that first murder with Stephen Hicks? Jeffrey's at the point of no return.
That first kill is definitely transformative. It's not just about the act of killing, but it's about what maybe unlocks inside the killer. For someone like Dahmer, I don't think it was necessarily the violence, but it was the control. I think that's what really hooked him. Loneliness and isolation can very easily take that initial anger and shift it into the realm of violence. If you listen to my episode, I think that was really portrayed well in the story about his father, which isn't someone that we factually know had any violent tendencies or was a killer, even if it was just a squirrel or an animal in your backyard. But I think it's pretty easy to make that stretch, especially in men, for a fight or something to go wrong. And that anger, that frustration that is oftentimes withheld, it just builds within. Then we have this violence outburst. So I think that the isolation, especially for an adolescent, the isolation and loneliness, they don't have the coping skills that adults might have to step out into the backyard. Maybe there's an isolated incident of something, but then there's the maturity and the skill set to reflect on that and recognize, okay, that isn't me, or that wasn't productive, or that didn't truly resolve maybe the tension between me and my wife. And they're able to navigate that. Whereas someone who isn't an adult, they just keep going further and they get lost because of how truly lonely and isolating anyone's adolescence and the challenge of a child kind of growing up and coming into their own and forming an identity can be. But you brought up the traffic stop, and I thought about that frequently in this story, and it made me laugh several times because you specifically loved to do traffic enforcement. As a police officer, you were even put in a position where you didn't necessarily respond to 911 calls or manage a beat, but were given the sole responsibility of the opportunity to just completely control your work shift and enforce traffic. I think that you made a great point when you ask the question if that traffic enforcement officer would have gone further, right? It's funny because a couple of days ago, we were en route to some community theater for an evening out with a friend. I got pulled over, stopped for speeding, and the officer was, and we've seen this in experiences you and I both have had since leaving law enforcement, right? And being on the other end of it, where we both had been pulled over, both times for speeding. The officer was very blunt in their approach. I think at least my officer was young, so it could be a lack of experience. We also saw this with coworkers, where I think through the hardness of training, maybe some of the fear-induced dangers of policing, trying to protect yourself from some of those things, officers can really easily fall into just a very static, kind of cold approach to something as asinine as a traffic stop. They aren't able to take the time or to develop the skills or to, I don't know, it could be different for each officer, but to push it further or to see it as pull them over, ask this question, get their information, and write a ticket. It's great for the officer. It's great for their stats. It's great for the department.
I don't necessarily fault the officer who pulled him over initially with the first victim in the back of the car. It was a routine traffic stop. It's a young kid. Hey, kid, take your ass home, whatever. I get that. Here's the problem I have. This is something I definitely want to get into because this was a huge red flag for me in this case. It was a huge turning point, or could have been a huge turning point in the case, was the Conorak sent the phone case, where you had this 14-year-old boy who Dahmer had drugged, was experimenting on, trying to turn him into a zombie. He gets out of Dahmer's apartment while Dahmer's gone to get some more alcohol. He's found on the street by Dahmer's neighbors, and they call the police, and you have these two officers respond. That could have changed the trajectory of everything. But I think they were, and I'm Monday morning quarterbacking here, but the problem I think here was a failure for these officers to go a step further. Don't think these officers were comfortable with the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer played this like they were just lovers. This was his 20-something-year-old lover. He got a little drunk, and he's going to take him back inside, and everything's going to be okay. They didn't push and ask more questions. And that's one of the things that really, frankly, pissed me off, because I think these officers, had they taken a different approach, they could have, procedure or not, I don't know what the procedures were. I haven't read the Milwaukee Police Department standard operating procedures on some sort of a situation like this. But I think you have to use your gut feeling, and very much not taking a traffic stop to the next step by asking a few extra questions to maybe do a little bit more investigative work. I don't think these officers did any of that stuff. And they turned this kid back over to this man who took him into his apartment and murdered him. It absolutely blows my mind. And that was one of my favorite parts of your episode, where you took that question and said, what if there had been an officer there? This female officer that you introduced into the story, who was a rookie, who was about a year on the department, who was a little bit more zealous in her approach to investigating what was going on these 911 calls, and had the story played out the way that you wrote it, we would be having a way different conversation right now, because there were other victims after Conorak sent the phone. But the problem is, the police dropped the ball here. I don't know. What do you think about the way that they approached that? How would you have handled that differently? Do you think it was just a sign of the times? We're talking early 90s here. It's not the same thing as it is in 2025 with LGBTQ stuff, police department training. How do you think you would have handled it differently? How do you think they could have handled it differently and maybe changed the trajectory of Jeffrey Dahmer's story?
Officers are human, so we're working with a limited amount of information. We're working with our own personal biases, whether we admit it or not. I definitely think we can all agree there were procedural failures within this specific incident. But I think that's a great opportunity to discuss. There's so much focus on procedure and policy, especially within law enforcement. That's often what is quickly criticized, or that's often what is the first kind of narrative of reform or evaluating or assessing. And you worked a lot in your appointed position, developing, writing, and then helping implement policy. I think especially with you and I at the time, you were in an appointed position where you were writing policy. And at the time, I was still on the streets implementing or using that policy while enforcing, right? And we had lots of great conversation behind the scenes and transparently at home, where I would be put in situations where I was responsible for juggling my 911 calls, maintaining the integrity of my beat, and also handling the specific case or call or incident in front of me. And that's a lot to manage for one human being. Oftentimes, the policy or procedure might have been there, but there are so many other cogs in the wheel that prevent it from being implemented or followed through as it's written or the ideal approach, right? But yeah, there were procedural failures without a doubt, but I think that human aspect of law enforcement is what is so often left in the shadows and not discussed, because it's really not policy or procedure. It's actually, does an officer have that ability and that skill set to go outside of these very narrow lines and defined policies and procedure and implement themselves in real time? And every call, even if it's the same call on the same beat with the same officer, it's always slightly different. And it's always just enough different that makes the importance of having a real person in that role in real time, being able to assess and evaluate, okay, what do I need to do here? I think that's what's missing oftentimes. And you and I even discussed this with coworkers. A lot of times when we would discuss scenes or incidences that would cause multiple officers to be on scene, it's really easy to quickly figure out, okay, this officer is not helping. I don't want this officer on my scene. And sometimes even other officers could prevent or hinder you from going beyond just the black and white of policy and procedure. Being able, oftentimes for me, at least policing, I found being able to be comfortable sitting with a situation within an incident and not just trying to move into action. These are the steps I was trained, or this is what I was taught, or this is how I handle this. And oftentimes sitting for a moment, looking or thinking about those things. You can't write that into policy and procedure. That's something that I think you can get through either experience outside of the classroom, running through scenarios, through training and whatnot, going beyond just the black and white of policy and procedure. I don't think that is something specific to the Dahmer case or even the time period of the Dahmer case. I think that's something that is still an issue, especially within policing, is the inability to identify those attributes and those skills within officers, whether it be through hiring or identifying ways to really successfully and effectively train officers to have those skills and abilities. I know for me, I saw plenty of times on a call when an officer's biases or their preconceived notions or things they might have been uncomfortable with just as a person would prevent them from truly exploring and investigating a case, and instead seeing it as just a call to check these procedural boxes, close the call out, and move on.
Standard operating procedure, SOP, rules and regulations are a very comfortable place for officers to hide, in my opinion. The one thing that we've always said, we knew it when we were police officers, it was the one thing that we knew that would never be taken away from us was our discretion as a police officer. We had agency and discretion in everything that we did, whether it was making the choice to write somebody a speeding ticket or let them go with a warning, or go out on a call where a 14-year-old boy is half naked on the street and appears to be intoxicated. You have the ability and the discretion to ask a few more questions, push it a little bit further, or do you just accept the word of this charismatic guy who happened to show up and say, oh, it's just my boyfriend? But I'm going to tell you something. Conarac Synthesophone did not look like a 20-something-year-old person that should be drunk. He looked like a 14-year-old boy. So I think those police officers, in my opinion, had a duty and a responsibility to take that a step further, because you also had the callers that made the 911 call who were telling them something is not right about this dude, and they chose to just move on and basically handed him back over. They literally took his life and handed it back to Dahmer, and he was promptly killed after they went back into the apartment. Something I want to talk about here, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because it's one of those things that comes up in almost every one of these serial killer cases. It is the concept of control. Most all of these crimes that we're talking about, specifically with Dahmer, it is all about control for those folks. But is control a form of power or a response to deeper insecurities? This is your wheelhouse here. This is the sociology and psychology part of these people's being. For Dahmer, it was all about the ultimate control. Dahmer didn't just want to control his victims for a small amount of time. Dahmer wanted to control them in life and death wholeheartedly.
Control isn't just about power. It's about filling a void. So Dahmer's need for control, I think, came from the deep, empty spaces within him, the ones that no relationship or society could fill. So this is an opportunity for us to shift the focus from some of the external things that we've discussed, such as family, home life, social life. And there's definitely a psychological need for control in all of us. And some of us, I think that it can serve as a coping mechanism for trauma or emotional voids. I think that was pretty common throughout Dahmer's story. I think that we've explored that and demonstrated that. But I think that some individuals seek control in destructive ways, especially in high stress or urban environments. I don't know about you, but I saw that a lot policing and through community policing. It was very easy to see in urban environments or high stress environments or marginalized communities where control might be used as a coping mechanism for the trauma or the emotional voids that individuals are facing. I know for me on my beat, I saw that a lot of times through the transient community that we would see or the homeless community. I remember so vividly a specific evening that I was on duty, and it was towards the end of my shift. I was hanging out with my work husband, my beat buddy, my friend from the academy that was my partner in crime at work. We were hanging out in our cars, just talking through the windows, waiting for the evening to come to a close. You know this name. Brian Cook will bring a lot of memories and fond reflection. Brian was a homeless individual that I met early on at the start of my policing career as a beat officer for my specific beat in Zone 2, and he pretty much followed me throughout my 5-year career in law enforcement. Through him, I saw a lot of these attributes and a lot of these things play out. Anyways, let me get back to the story. I was waiting for the shift to end, just shooting the breeze with my coworker. Brian Cook approached us. I thought it was just going to be some fun, crazy kind of banter back and forth like I typically had with him. Usually when he was under the influence of drugs and quite high and funny and enjoyable to be around, frankly. He approached our cars and I could immediately tell that he was not his typical energetic, spastic, all over the place. He was very quiet, very somber. He seemed defeated in a way that I typically didn't experience Brian Cook. And he approached the cars, and of course, we were like, hey, what's up? He asked us to arrest him, take him into custody, and take him to jail. He said, hey, I've got some drugs on me. They're in this pocket. Can you put charges on me and take me down to jail? And I was just like, yes, I can. I can do that. But how will that serve you? I was also thinking it will prevent me from getting off on time and getting home. But how is that going to help you? Someone who is looking for a way to control their experience. Leaving him on the street that night, he would have been the victim of all of these elements that he couldn't control, right? The street, you and I have talked about this often. I can't imagine, especially going into the evening and overnight, not having a safe place to just rest. So all of these things were outside of his control. And it's a great example of Brian Cook using control, approaching an officer that he had a rapport with, approaching an officer he knew he could disclose that he was committing a crime and he wasn't going to be roughhoused or treated poorly. There was a safety in that, and he was able to say it like it was. Just say, hey, can we skip all that and just get right to take me in? Because he was seeking any opportunity for him to have control. And in this case, it was ultimately committing a crime. So that's my experience, kind of through the lens and perspective of a beat cop. I'm interested to know if you, Brian, can provide any insight in a more structured environment. Managing a detention center, it's the polar opposite in regards to the amount of control of a beat cop or community policing on the street. Do you think that there are any dynamics or ways in which structured environments like detention centers might reveal control dynamics in young offenders. Or when you saw maybe through policy and procedure and the structure of a detention center where you had an element of control that you might have been imposing on someone and maybe their attempt to push back and regain that control.
Yeah, there are tons of examples of that inside a detention center. It was completely a different scenario than being on the streets of Atlanta as a beat cop, putting people in jail. We had a very strict environment in the facility. They had to walk in a certain way. They all dressed the same. They had to walk with their hands behind their backs. When they went into their cells at night, they had to put their shoes outside the door. There was all of these controlled things, and they were not in control of most things that went on during the day. By and large, animals, children, and people in general like some form of control. They like structure. They like to be controlled. Most of these kids that were coming into the facility had zero control over anything in their house. There was very little structure. So a lot of those kids thrived in that environment. And that's why they reoffended once they were released. Like I talked about earlier, you take them out of that environment where they have all this control and the structure, and then you put them back into the same situations they were in. They end up coming back. I think when it comes to being outside of that and just in general, that's what drives a lot of these folks that ultimately commit these crimes, is because they do feel this lack of control. Their crimes and controlling the people, their victims, gives them the ultimate control over everything in their life, or at least in that moment they have the control that they seek. Maybe the rest of their life is a disaster. They don't do very well in social situations or hold down a job or those kind of things. But they give themselves that control, very much like the story you told with Brian. That was him exercising agency and as much control as he had over his life at the time. I think it's very similar to some of these people like Jeffrey Dahmer and some of the other prolific serial killers that we may talk about eventually. That's them exercising their agency and control over other people. I want to get into this other aspect of it. Obviously, it's very profound in the Jeffrey Dahmer case. There's some other cases we can certainly talk about at some point in time. But the intersection of sexuality and criminal behavior, I think this goes back to some of the breakdown in the police work in these cases, because when you involve a sexual nature in the crime, and most of these cases do have some sort of sexual component to them, you're dealing with marginalized communities. And let's face it, the 1980s were not kind to the LGBTQ plus community, and law enforcement certainly reflected those biases. This neglect in law enforcement at the time created the perfect storm for predators like Jeffrey Dahmer to prey on this marginalized community, the gay male community in Milwaukee at the time. He hunted most of his victims in gay bars. I think that's part of the issue that allowed Dahmer to hunt and prey on these people for so long, because by and large, law enforcement officers have a problem with things that they're not used to. The LGBT community was not something that I'm sure the Milwaukee Police Department was training the recruits on. But when it comes to law enforcement, I think it creates blind spots, and that's very dangerous. We see it in some of the other cases like the Atlanta child murders. You have these poor black kids that are being victimized. It comes with the John Wayne Gacy case, where he preys on these teenage boys that don't have a lot of supervision at home. There's all of these things. What did you find when you looked into this case about that connection with the criminal behavior, the sexuality, and maybe even being some of the cause for law enforcement? I don't want to say looking the wrong way, but certainly having blind spots when it comes to their investigation.
Great points. I definitely agree with you. I think that societal biases or our personal biases, even in a law enforcement officer, can definitely lead to dangerous blind spots within investigations. As an officer working in a heavily gay neighborhood, I saw the way society turned a blind eye to these communities. So it's no surprise to me that Dahmer targeted them, knowing that society saw them as disposable. And I think that, like you brought up in other cases, is very relevant and very important to discuss and shed some light on. I think that these biases still persist today. I know that we've had some progress. I don't think that we've had nearly enough progress. So speaking about marginalized communities, when I was on patrol, trust was built one interaction at a time. You can't just demand it, you have to earn it. And when trust is broken, it's devastating, especially for these marginalized communities. Again, that's something you can't write into policy. That's something I would argue you can train, but it's oftentimes not given and allocated the budget and the time for training. Officers are hitting the streets without the ability to build trust ultimately. At face value, any interaction between law enforcement and a citizen, the citizen is already going into it with a lack of trust because of all of the different examples that we've seen where power, control, the badge, and whatnot has been abused. Do you have any insights, Brian, specifically when you worked with troubled youth, how early trust building can prevent long-term harm, or any example of maybe a child in the detention center, or when you were policing? You definitely did a significant amount of community policing early on in your career on the streets of Atlanta. But an example of when you were able to utilize building trust with someone, preventing maybe the trajectory of the amount of harm they might have been capable of or might have been prone to commit.
Yeah, there was a lot of relationships that I built in the facility with some of the kids that were there long term. And trust is built. Like you said, it's not something you can demand. It's got to be built on a mutual understanding and actions. The best way to build trust in a facility like that where somebody's locked up is you treat them like a person. You give them what you say you're going to get, and you hold them accountable, and you ultimately build that trust. I think it's the same thing on the streets. I worked the same area. I was a beat cop. I had beats where I had to go in and deal with the same people over and over again. We had a couple of situations I remember in some of the public housing sections that I was assigned to at the time where you'd have fights and would have big crowds fighting each other for whatever reason. I remember one time in particular, I was one of the first officers to arrive on the scene, and there was a group of probably 50 or 60 people. It was a big mess of a situation. And because I had built such a rapport and such a trust with the people that were out there, not everybody, I didn't know all of them, but I knew a great deal of the people that were involved in that situation. As soon as they saw my face, they saw me get out of the car, I was able to gain control of the situation. Everybody backed down, calmed down, and they listened to what I had to say. But it was only because I had already worked and laid the foundation of that trust in that community that I was able to do that. So again, I think it's one of those things, like you said, you can't really train that in the academy, but it comes down to the responsibility of the officer that's working that particular area to build that kind of trust with the community. Because if you don't have it, that could have went south really quickly. I could have been a statistic in the middle of, they could have easily overpowered me, 50, 60 people. It could have ended very poorly, but because I'd built that trust with the community, I think that's one of the things that eroded away with the Dahmer case. People ultimately look at the police and say, why didn't you catch this guy? Why did so many people have to die before you guys caught them? I think that's one of those things. People's reality is their truth. I think that happened in the Dahmer case because so many people were going missing. I think it goes back to the marginalized portion of the community that Dahmer was preying on. As far as his victims are concerned, they weren't looking for gay men of color who disappeared, and a lot of his victims were gay men of color. I think it just goes to, again, it goes back to we're Monday morning quarterback in the Milwaukee Police Department, but I think they could have done some things to work with that marginalized community when they saw that so many people in the gay community disappeared. I think the officers that were in that area, or certainly even the police department as a whole, could have reached out into that community and said, look, we think there's something going on here. We're seeing a pattern. You guys need to communicate with each other. Be careful. They could have done all those things, and they just chose not to. And I think that's one of the failures in trust that came out of the Dahmer situation because it was very localized. He was taking them all from this general area in and around Milwaukee. I think that made their job a little bit easier as far as law enforcement. Again, it goes back to, is there an issue with the sexual component? Is it a problem with the LGBT community being involved? I don't know. I think there's a lot there. One of the other things I want to get into before we get out of here is the media frenzy that obviously came with this case. Everybody who's seen the Dahmer case or watched a documentary or seen anything on the news, once Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested, they got the search warrant. They went into his apartment. That visual of them bringing out these containers, these 55-gallon drums filled with acid and body parts. You see them taking out the refrigerator and the freezer with these victims inside. There was a huge media frenzy, but there wasn't a whole lot of media digging into Jeffrey Dahmer in the beginning. Once he was caught, they created a legend. And they turned him into this symbol of fear that overshadowed his victims and some of the systematic failures in the police. How do you feel in general, whether it be the Dahmer case or some of these other cases that we're going to talk about on the show or have talked about on the show? The media certainly plays a part in this circus. How do you feel about the media's involvement in Dahmer's case and just in these cases in general?
Yeah, so closing out the trust conversation between law enforcement and the community, it isn't just important. I think we both can agree that it's critical. And when people don't believe that the system will protect them, predators like Dahmer can find the perfect cover, frankly. Transitioning into the media frenzy and the idolization of or the creation of this hero or villain, depending on how you look at it, is a great topic to look at it before we close out. The media has this way of turning tragedy into entertainment. It's the victim stories that get lost in the noise and we're left remembering the monster instead of the lives that they might have stolen. And I think that's mostly because media narratives, for their impact and value, they have to create these heroes and these villains. And they often leave nuance behind. I think that especially seeing that currently, I can think off the top of my head, and I don't even watch a significant amount of television or media. I can think of at least 3, if not 4, relatively current either television shows, movies, or miniseries that the Dahmer case has been used to create nuance, sensationalizing the narrative in the story. I think an important thing to note is that oftentimes this frenzy, media coverage, and sensationalism, it truly does have impacts on the justice system. For most people, they see it as an opportunity to engage and truly just be entertained. They aren't aware of, and there's less attention given to the implications and the impacts that these sensationalisms and media drives and push have on the justice system.
I definitely agree with that. And as always, we want to hear from you guys. You can always head over to paranormalworldproductions.com. Check out the show there. We have a button where you can leave us a voicemail. You can send us an email, Brian and or Dani at paranormalworldproductions.com. We'd love to hear what you have to say about Jeffrey Dahmer, any of the things that we've talked about, or any of the other cases that we've covered here on the show. As always, I like to close out by saying, I like to challenge everybody who's listening to stay curious, always question the systems that shape us, and don't be afraid to seek the truth in the darkest corners of human behavior.